My grandson used me for views, so I turned off the Wi-Fi, the fridge, and the bank transfer. The silence that followed wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the echo of a heart breaking in real time. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I'd share. And if you, for even a second, feel like this story sounds familiar, I just ask that you leave a like and subscribe, because this story might help someone draw closer to God's love. Amen. My name is Helen Margaret Richardson, and I am 78 years old. This morning, like every morning for the past 43 years, I sat in my faded blue recliner with my worn King James Bible resting on my lap, my arthritic fingers tracing the gold-edged pages that had absorbed decades of tears, prayers, and whispered pleas to the Almighty. The chair had been my husband Robert's favorite spot before the Lord called him home when I was just 36, leaving me to raise our daughter Sarah alone in this small house on Maple Street in Cedar Falls, Iowa. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains I'd sewn myself back in 1987, casting gentle shadows across the living room walls adorned with family photographs that told the story of a life lived in service to others. There was Sarah at her high school graduation, her smile radiant with possibility. Sarah holding 3-year-old Nathan at his baptism, her eyes already shadowed by the illness that would take her from us just 2 years later. And Nathan, my sweet Nathan, at every age from toddler to young man, his face lighting up my world through every season of joy and sorrow. I had been reading Psalm 27 when my phone buzzed with a notification I didn't understand. At my age, technology felt like a foreign language, but Nathan had patiently taught me how to use the smartphone he'd insisted on buying me last Christmas. "Grandma," he'd said, his warm brown eyes sparkling with affection, "you need to stay connected with the world. Plus, this way I can share our special moments with people who need to see real love." That morning, the notification was from something called YouTube, a platform where Nathan created what he called content. I'd never fully grasped what that meant, but I knew it made him happy, and his happiness had become the center of my universe since Sarah passed. He lived with me now, had been my constant companion for 3 years, and I thanked God every night for the blessing of his presence in my twilight years. The notification read, "New video. Living with Grandma. She doesn't know I film her sleeping." My blood turned cold as I read those words, each letter burning itself into my consciousness like a brand. With trembling fingers that had once sewn Halloween costumes and bandaged scraped knees, I tapped the screen to open the video. What I saw shattered 43 years of carefully maintained dignity. There I was, captured in my most vulnerable moments, asleep in my chair, my mouth slightly open, my gray hair disheveled, my body curved in the unconscious position of someone whose bones ached with age. The video had been edited with soft, melancholic piano music, the kind they play at funerals, and text overlays that made my stomach lurch. "She falls asleep crying most nights. All she has left is me. This is what loneliness looks like." But it was the comments section that delivered the killing blow. Thousands of strangers had watched me in my unconscious state, and their responses ranged from pity to praise for Nathan's devotion to his helpless grandmother. They called me precious, forgotten, and blessed to have such a caring grandson. Some had even sent money, donations that I now realized had been flowing into Nathan's accounts for months. I sat there in my recliner, the same chair where I'd prayed for Nathan's safety every night since he'd come to live with me, where I'd asked God to bless him, protect him, and help him find his way in the world. The same chair where I'd held him as a grieving child, where I'd read him Bible stories and taught him the Lord's Prayer. Now it felt like a trap, a stage where I'd unknowingly performed my loneliness for the entertainment of strangers. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical pain I'd ever endured, deeper than the arthritis that made my joints scream on cold mornings, deeper even than the grief I'd felt when burying my husband and daughter. This was the pain of discovering that the person you'd sacrificed everything for saw you not as a beloved family member, but as content to be consumed. I remembered all the times Nathan had positioned his phone casually around the house, claiming he was just charging it or had forgotten it there. I remembered how he'd encouraged me to tell stories about the old days, about losing Robert, about raising Sarah alone, about the loneliness that sometimes crept in during the long Iowa winters. I'd thought he was simply interested in family history, in understanding the woman who'd given up her golden years to raise him after his mother's death. Now I understood. He'd been harvesting my pain. The video had 2.3 million views. 2.3 million strangers had watched me sleep, had consumed my vulnerability like entertainment, had pitied the sweet old lady who didn't know she was being watched. The shame burned through me like acid, making my chest tight and my breathing shallow. I closed the phone with shaking hands and looked around the living room that had been my sanctuary for nearly 5 decades. The walls still held the same family photos, the same cross my mother had given me on my wedding day, the same small shelf of devotional books that had sustained me through every crisis. But something fundamental had shifted. The safety I'd felt in my own home, the trust I'd placed in the grandson I'd raised as my own son, the dignity I'd maintained through poverty and loss and decades of quiet struggle, all of it had been violated with the casual cruelty of someone who saw love as a commodity to be monetized. Nathan was at work, or so he'd told me. In reality, I now wondered if he'd gone somewhere to plan his next video, his next exploitation of the woman who'd given him everything she had to give. The house felt different around me. No longer a home, but a film set where I'd been an unwitting actor in a performance I'd never agreed to give. I opened my Bible again, but the words blurred through tears I couldn't hold back. "The Lord is my light and my salvation," I whispered, my voice breaking on the familiar words. "Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" But in that moment, sitting in the ruins of my trust, I was afraid of everything. The phone slipped from my trembling hands and clattered onto the hardwood floor beside my recliner. As I bent to retrieve it, my knees protesting with sharp pains that shot up my thighs, I caught sight of the old photo album wedged between the chair cushion and armrest, the one Nathan used to love looking through as a child. With unsteady fingers, I pulled it free and let it fall open across my lap. There we were, captured in happier times. Nathan at age 4, gap-toothed and grinning, wearing the Superman costume I'd sewn by hand because store-bought ones were beyond my budget. I'd worked 3 jobs then, cleaning offices at night, doing alterations for the local dry cleaner during the day, and watching the Johnsons' baby on weekends. Every penny had gone toward raising that boy, toward making sure he never felt the poverty that had defined my own childhood. I remembered that Halloween night like it was yesterday. Nathan had been so proud of his costume, running from house to house with a pillowcase that grew heavier with each doorstep. When we got home, he'd dumped all his candy on the kitchen table and immediately started sorting it into 2 piles. One for him, one for me. "Grandma," he'd said with the earnest solemnity that only children possess, "you deserve the good chocolate because you make everything better." Those words had sustained me through so many difficult nights. When the electric bill came and I had to choose between heat and groceries, I'd remember that little boy's voice telling me I made everything better. When my back ached from scrubbing floors until 2 in the morning, when my eyes burned from squinting over delicate embroidery work by lamplight, when the loneliness of widowhood threatened to swallow me whole, I held on to the belief that I was making everything better for someone who truly loved me. The photo album revealed a chronology of sacrifice disguised as love. Nathan's first day of school, wearing new clothes I'd bought by selling my wedding ring, the last tangible connection to Robert, melted down into cash for back-to-school shopping. Nathan's 8th birthday party, celebrated with a homemade cake and decorations crafted from dollar store supplies, but his face glowing with joy because 12 neighborhood children had come to celebrate with him. I'd spent my grocery money on pizza for those kids, then lived on crackers and peanut butter for 2 weeks afterward. Every page told the same story. Helen gives, Nathan receives, and the world keeps spinning. But I'd never seen it as sacrifice then. I'd seen it as purpose. God had taken my husband and daughter, but he'd left me with this beautiful boy who needed me, who called me his angel, who told me bedtime stories about how we'd travel the world together when he grew up and became rich and famous. "Lord," I whispered into the empty room, my voice barely audible above the ticking of the mantel clock Robert had given me for our 10th wedding anniversary. I gave him everything. I gave him my whole life. Was I wrong to love him so completely? The silence that answered felt heavier than any rebuke. I flipped through more pages, each photograph a testament to years of putting Nathan's needs before my own. High school graduation, where I'd sat in the front row beaming with pride, wearing the same dress I'd worn to every special occasion for 5 years because new clothes were an impossible luxury. College acceptance letters spread across our kitchen table, scholarships I'd helped him apply for, essays I'd proofread by candlelight to save on electricity, dreams I'd nurtured with every sacrifice I could manage. But it was the more recent photos that now felt like evidence in a trial, where I'd been both victim and unwitting accomplice. Nathan at 22, posing with the expensive camera he'd bought with his first content creation earnings. Nathan at 24, holding up his smartphone and grinning as he recorded what he called authentic moments of our daily life. Me in the background of so many shots, always unaware, always genuine, always vulnerable. I remembered the day he'd started filming more frequently. He'd sat me down at this very kitchen table, his expression serious and caring, and explained that he wanted to document our relationship because it was so special and rare in today's world. He'd spoken about how lonely elderly people felt isolated, how his videos could bring comfort to others who were struggling with similar situations. "Grandma," he'd said, reaching across the table to squeeze my weathered hand with his smooth, young fingers. "You're an inspiration. People need to see that kind of genuine love still exists. You're helping people just by being yourself." I'd been so proud, so honored to think that my simple life, my quiet faith, my love for this boy might somehow comfort strangers who were walking through their own valleys of loneliness. When he'd shown me the comments from viewers calling me blessed and precious, when he'd read me messages from people saying our relationship gave them hope for their own families, I'd felt a warmth I hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. I'd thought I was serving God by allowing Nathan to share our story. I'd thought I was being useful in my old age, relevant in a world that seemed to have no place for women like me. I'd actually thanked the Lord in my prayers for giving me this unexpected ministry in my twilight years. But now, staring at these photographs with new eyes, I could see the truth that had been hidden from me. The camera angles that captured me at my most vulnerable, bent over the sink washing dishes, struggling to reach items on high shelves, falling asleep during evening news programs, the way Nathan had encouraged me to share my deepest sorrows, the nights I'd lain awake missing Robert, the fear I carried about dying alone, the financial worries that kept me up past midnight calculating and recalculating the household budget. He'd positioned himself as my caretaker, my devoted grandson, who'd chosen to live with his elderly grandmother instead of pursuing his own independent life. The viewers saw him as a saint, a young man who'd sacrificed his freedom to care for a helpless old woman. They praised his patience, his kindness, his dedication to family values. But what they didn't see was the truth behind the performance. They didn't know that Nathan had moved in with me not out of love, but out of convenience. His college debt had been crushing, his entry-level job barely covering his car payment and student loans. Living with Grandma Helen meant free rent, free food, free utilities, and a built-in caretaker for his own needs. I cooked his meals, did his laundry, cleaned his room, and asked for nothing in return except his company. I'd been so grateful for that company that I'd never questioned the arrangement. I'd never wondered why a 25-year-old man would choose to live with his grandmother instead of building his own life. I'd simply thanked God every night for the blessing of not being alone, for having someone to cook for, someone to worry about, someone to love. The kitchen clock chimed 3 times, its sound echoing through the house like a funeral bell. Nathan would be home soon. If he was really at work and not orchestrating another video designed to showcase my helplessness. I wondered how many times he'd filmed me without my knowledge, how many of my private moments had been transformed into content for strangers to consume, how many tears I'd shed in solitude had become material for his profit. Am I being tested, or just forgotten? I whispered to the empty room, my voice breaking on the question that had haunted me through sleepless nights for months without my understanding why. I closed the photo album and held it against my chest, feeling the weight of all those memories, all those years of believing I was building something beautiful with this boy I'd raised as my own son. The house around me felt different now, not like home, but like a stage set where I'd been performing the role of the loving grandmother while the real audience watched from behind hidden cameras, consuming my authenticity like entertainment. Outside, the Iowa wind rattled the windows I'd washed just yesterday, wanting everything to be perfect for Nathan's return from work. I'd spent the morning baking his favorite cookies, cleaning his room, preparing his dinner, all while he'd been out planning new ways to monetize my love. The cookies I'd baked for Nathan sat cooling on the wire rack, their chocolate chip aroma filling the kitchen with the scent of domestic normalcy that now felt like a cruel joke. I stared at them, 12 perfect circles of love and tradition, and wondered how many times he'd filmed me baking for him. My bent figure hunched over the counter, my arthritic hands carefully measuring ingredients I could barely afford. The front door opened with its familiar creak at exactly 5:47 p.m., just as it had every weekday for 3 years. Nathan's voice called out with practiced cheerfulness, "Grandma, I'm home! Something smells amazing in here." But this time, instead of feeling the warm flutter of joy I usually experienced when he returned, I felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest. I watched him enter the kitchen, his young face bright with the smile that had charmed me for over 2 decades, and I saw him differently. The way his eyes immediately scanned the room, noting the fresh cookies, the clean counters, the dinner I'd prepared and kept warm in the oven. The way he pulled out his phone with practiced casualness, holding it at an angle that would capture both of us in the frame. "Grandma made my favorite cookies again," he said to the phone's camera, his voice taking on that particular tone I'd heard in his videos. Warmer, more performative than his natural speaking voice. "Look at this woman, 78 years old and still taking care of everyone else. Isn't she incredible?" The words that had once made my heart swell with pride now felt like tiny knives. I stood frozen by the stove, my oven mitts still on my hands, watching him record my reaction to his praise. He was waiting for me to smile, to blush with pleasure at his compliments, to play my role in whatever narrative he was crafting for his audience. "Nathan," I said quietly, my voice sounding strange to my own ears, "could you put the phone away, please? I'd like to talk to you." His expression flickered, just for a moment, with something I'd never seen before. Annoyance, maybe, or calculation. But then the charming smile returned, and he slipped the phone into his pocket. "Of course, Grandma. You know I love our talks." I removed my oven mitts with deliberate slowness, buying time to find the words for a conversation I'd never imagined having. How do you ask someone you've loved unconditionally whether they've been exploiting that love for profit? How do you question the motives of the person who'd become your entire world without sounding paranoid or ungrateful? "I saw one of your videos today," I began, my hands gripping the edge of the counter for support. "The one where you filmed me sleeping." Nathan's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, embarrassment, then something that looked almost like relief. "Oh, that one. Grandma, I hope you weren't upset. I know I should have asked first, but you just looked so peaceful, and I thought people would enjoy seeing—" "Enjoy seeing what, exactly?" The words came out sharper than I'd intended, surprising both of us. I'd never interrupted Nathan before, never questioned his decisions or expressed displeasure with anything he did. For 3 years, I'd been the perfect, grateful grandmother, always supportive, always understanding. He blinked, clearly taken aback by my tone. "Well, I mean, people love seeing authentic moments, real relationships. You and we have something special, and I just wanted to share that with the world. There's so much fake stuff online, but what we have is genuine." "Genuine," I repeated, tasting the word like it was poison. Is it genuine when one person doesn't know they're being filmed? Is it genuine when you add music and captions to make me look more pitiful than I actually am? Nathan's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. In all his 25 years, I'd never challenged him like this. I'd been the soft place he could always land, the unconditional love he could always count on, the audience that would always applaud his choices. "Grandma, you're misunderstanding." "Am I?" I moved away from the stove, my legs shaky but determined. "Help me understand then. Help me understand why you told your viewers that I cry myself to sleep most nights. Help me understand why you made me look helpless and forgotten when I've never asked for pity from anyone. The kitchen suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing in as Nathan struggled to find words that would restore the comfortable dynamic we'd maintained for years. I could see him recalibrating, trying to find the right tone to soothe me back into compliance. "Grandma, sit down. Please. You're getting yourself worked up over nothing." His voice had taken on a patronizing gentleness that I'd heard him use with difficult customers at his retail job. "I would never do anything to hurt you. You know that, right? You're the most important person in my life." But instead of sitting down, instead of allowing myself to be managed and soothed, I remained standing. The photo album I'd been looking at earlier still lay open on the counter, and I gestured toward it with trembling fingers. "Look at these pictures, Nathan. Really look at them. Do you see what I see? A woman who gave up everything for you. A woman who worked 3 jobs to buy you clothes, who sold her wedding ring to pay for your school supplies, who lived on crackers and water so you could have birthday parties with your friends." His eyes followed my gaze to the photographs, and for a moment, something like shame flickered across his features. But it was quickly replaced by defensive irritation. "I never asked you to do those things," he said, his voice taking on an edge I'd never heard before. "I never asked you to sacrifice so much. And besides, isn't that what family does? Isn't that what love looks like?" The casualness of his dismissal, the way he could acknowledge my decades of sacrifice while simultaneously minimizing their significance, hit me like a physical blow. I gripped the counter harder, my knuckles white with the strain of holding myself upright. "You're right," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You never asked. I gave freely because I loved you, because I thought you needed me, because I believed we were building something together, a family, a bond, a life that mattered." I paused, gathering strength for the words that would change everything between us. But what I didn't know was that you were turning my love into a commodity, that you were selling my vulnerability to strangers on the internet, that every tender moment, every private struggle, every expression of grief or loneliness was just material for your next video. Nathan's facade was beginning to crack now. The charming smile had disappeared completely, replaced by something harder and more calculating. "You don't understand how this works, Grandma. Content creation is a business. I'm building a brand, creating value, engaging with an audience. The money I make from those videos, it helps both of us. It pays for groceries, utilities, improvements to the house." "Improvements to the house?" I laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Nathan, I pay for the groceries. I pay the utilities. I pay the property taxes and the insurance and the repairs. The only thing your video money has paid for is that expensive camera equipment in your room and the designer clothes you wear to impress people who don't know you're living rent-free with your grandmother." The truth hung between us like a weapon neither of us had expected me to wield. For 3 years, I'd played the role of the grateful, dependent elderly woman who was blessed to have such a devoted grandson. I'd never mentioned that my Social Security and pension covered all the household expenses, that Nathan contributed nothing to our shared living situation beyond his presence. His face flushed red, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Not just anger, but contempt, as if I'd violated some unspoken agreement by acknowledging the reality of our arrangement. "Jesus, Grandma, do you want me to pay rent? Is that what this is about? You want me to treat you like a landlord instead of family?" The casual blasphemy, using our Savior's name in anger, stung almost as much as the accusation. I'd raised Nathan in the church, taught him to pray, read him Bible stories, shown him what it meant to live by Christian principles. But somewhere along the way, those lessons had been forgotten or discarded. "This isn't about money, Nathan," I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. "This is about respect. This is about honesty. This is about whether you see me as your grandmother who loves you, or as content to be consumed." The word "consumed" seemed to hit him like a slap. He took a step back, his expression shifting from defensive anger to something that looked almost like fear. "I can't believe you're saying these things," he muttered, pulling out his phone again. "Maybe I should record this conversation. Show people what you're really like when the cameras aren't rolling." And there it was. The threat that revealed everything, the suggestion that my worth was tied to my performance, that my value existed only in how I appeared to his audience, that if I stepped out of my assigned role as the grateful, helpless grandmother, I might find myself portrayed as something else entirely. I looked at this young man I'd raised, this person I'd loved more than my own life, and realized I was looking at a stranger. The threat to record our private conversation hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had been smoldering for years, finally erupting into visible flames. I stared at Nathan's phone, that device that had become more familiar to him than prayer, more precious than the grandmother who'd raised him. In that moment, I understood that I wasn't looking at my beloved grandson anymore. I was looking at someone who saw me as a resource to be managed, a performance to be directed. "Record it," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Record it all, Nathan. Show them the woman who raised you questioning why you've been filming her without permission. Show them the grandmother who's tired of being treated like a prop in your online theater." He lowered the phone, his expression shifting from threatening to confused. This wasn't the script he'd grown accustomed to. For 3 years, any conflict between us had been resolved by his charm, his apologies, his ability to make me feel guilty for questioning his choices. I'd always been the one to back down, to smooth things over, to prioritize his comfort over my own concerns. "Grandma, what's gotten into you?" he asked, and I could hear genuine bewilderment in his voice. "You're acting like you don't trust me anymore." The question pierced through my chest like a blade. Trust. Such a simple word, yet it carried the weight of everything I'd given him. Not just money and shelter and care, but the complete vulnerability of someone who'd placed their entire heart in another person's hands. "Should I trust you, Nathan?" I asked, walking slowly toward the kitchen table where we'd shared thousands of meals, where I'd helped him with homework, where we'd discussed his dreams and fears and plans for the future. Should I trust someone who's been secretly filming me for months? Someone who's been telling strangers on the internet that I'm helpless and forgotten? I pulled out one of the wooden chairs, the same ones I'd bought secondhand 30 years ago, and refinished myself, and sat down heavily. My legs felt weak, not from age but from the emotional weight of this confrontation that was reshaping everything I thought I knew about my life. "Let me ask you something," I continued, my hands folded on the table in front of me like I was preparing to pray. "When you moved in here 3 years ago, what did you tell people? What did you tell your friends, your coworkers, your online audience?" Nathan shifted uncomfortably, his phone still in his hand but no longer pointed at me like a weapon. "I told them I was taking care of you, that you needed me." And what did I need you for, specifically?" The question hung between us while he struggled to find an answer that wouldn't sound as hollow as we both knew it was. The truth was that I'd been living independently for decades before he'd moved in. I'd been managing my own finances, maintaining my own home, cooking my own meals, handling my own medical appointments. I'd never asked for help, never expressed an inability to care for myself. You were lonely," he said finally, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "After Grandpa died, and then Mom, you were all alone in this big house." "I was alone," I agreed. "But I wasn't helpless. I wasn't crying myself to sleep every night. I wasn't the broken, pitiful woman you've been portraying in your videos." The cookies on the counter had gone cold, their chocolate chips now solid again, much like the warmth that had once existed between us. The kitchen that had been filled with laughter and shared stories now felt like a courtroom where a verdict was being rendered. Nathan's phone buzzed with a notification, and I watched his eyes flick toward it instinctively. Even in this moment of crisis, his attention was divided between the woman who'd raised him and the digital audience that had become his primary concern. "Don't," I said sharply, and he looked up, startled. "Don't look at that phone. Don't check your messages. Don't think about your viewers. For once in the past 3 years, just be here with me. Be present in this moment without turning it into content." He slipped the phone into his pocket, but I could see the effort it took, the way his hand twitched toward it like an addiction he couldn't quite control. "I want to show you something," I said, standing up and walking to the old secretary desk in the corner of the kitchen, a piece of furniture that had belonged to my mother, where I kept important papers and family documents. From the bottom drawer, I pulled out a manila folder thick with bank statements, receipts, and financial records. "Do you know what this is?" I asked, setting the folder on the table between us. Nathan shook his head, his expression wary. These are my financial records for the past 3 years. Every penny I've earned, every bill I've paid, every expense I've covered. I opened the folder and spread out the papers like evidence in a trial. Here's my Social Security statement. Here's my pension from the school district where I worked as a custodian for 23 years. Here are the utility bills, the property tax statements, the grocery receipts. I watched his face as he took in the numbers, the clear documentation of a household supported entirely by my income. His monthly contribution to our shared expenses was exactly $0. Here's what I want you to understand, Nathan, I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. I haven't been a burden you've been carrying. I haven't been the helpless grandmother you've been nobly caring for. I've been the woman keeping a roof over your head, food on your table, and clothes on your back while you've been telling the world that you're my caretaker. The color drained from his face as the full scope of his deception, not just to his audience but to himself, became undeniable. He'd been living a lie so completely that I wondered if he'd begun to believe it himself. But that's not even the worst part, I said, reaching for another document I'd been saving for this moment. The worst part is this. I placed a bank statement in front of him, pointing to a series of deposits from various online platforms, YouTube, PayPal, Venmo, other services I didn't fully understand but had researched after discovering his videos. $12,000 in the past 6 months, I said, my voice quiet but steady. $12,000 that strangers have donated because they believe the story you were telling about your poor, helpless grandmother. Money that was given out of compassion for a woman they thought was struggling, alone, and forgotten. Nathan stared at the statement, his mouth opening and closing without words. I could see him trying to formulate a response, a justification, an explanation that would make this all seem reasonable. I never asked for that money, he said finally. People just started sending it. I can't help what my viewers choose to do. But you kept it, I replied. You kept money that was given out of pity for me. You kept donations that were meant to help a struggling elderly woman. You kept funds that were given by people who thought they were supporting someone in need. The weight of this revelation seemed to settle on his shoulders like a physical burden. For the first time since this conversation began, he looked genuinely ashamed. I used some of it for the house, he said weakly, for groceries, for things we both needed. Show me, I said, pulling out my own bank statements. Show me one deposit from you into our joint account. Show me one receipt for groceries purchased with that money. Show me one utility bill paid with donations from your viewers. The silence stretched between us as he realized he couldn't produce any such evidence. The money had gone toward his camera equipment, his clothes, his car payments, his personal expenses. None of it had ever been used for the household he claimed to be supporting. Nathan, I said, my voice breaking slightly as the full weight of his betrayal settled over me like a shroud. These people donated money because they thought you were sacrificing your own opportunities to care for me. They sent funds because they believed you were struggling financially due to your devotion to your grandmother. They gave from their own limited resources because they were moved by what they thought was your selfless love. I paused, gathering strength for the words that would change everything between us forever. But the truth is, you've been living rent-free in my house, eating food I buy, using utilities I pay for while collecting money from people who think you're my caretaker. You've been profiting from their compassion while contributing nothing to the household you claim to be supporting. The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the silence that followed, each second marking the end of the relationship I'd treasured above all others. Nathan sat slumped in his chair, his usual confidence and charm completely deflated, replaced by something that looked like recognition of his own actions for the first time. Would Jesus forgive this too? I whispered, more to myself than to him. Should I forgive this again, like I've forgiven everything else? But even as I asked the question, I knew something fundamental had shifted inside me. The unconditional love I'd always felt for this boy had been damaged by the casual cruelty of his exploitation. The trust I'd given so freely had been shattered by the systematic deception he'd maintained for years. Grandma, he said, his voice small and uncertain. I'm sorry. I never meant for it to get this complicated. Complicated? I repeated, the word bitter on my tongue. Nathan, you've been selling my dignity to strangers on the internet. You've been monetizing my loneliness, my grief, my love for you. That's not complicated. That's calculated. That night, I lay awake in my bed, the same bed where I'd prayed over Nathan's fever as a child, where I'd read him stories about David facing Goliath, where I'd knelt beside him as he said his prayers before drifting off to sleep. But the house felt different now, charged with a tension that hadn't existed before our kitchen confrontation. Through the thin walls, I could hear Nathan moving around in his room, probably editing another video or responding to comments from his audience. At 3:17 a.m., according to the digital clock on my nightstand, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. I got up, wrapped my worn terry cloth robe around my shoulders, and walked quietly to my desk where I kept my laptop. A gift from Nathan that I'd always assumed was motivated by love, but now understood might have been another tool to keep me accessible for his content creation. With trembling fingers that had learned to navigate technology out of necessity rather than choice, I opened my banking app and stared at the account information that represented my entire financial security. My monthly Social Security check, my small pension from decades of custodial work, my modest savings account that had been slowly growing since Nathan moved in, and I'd foolishly believed we were sharing expenses. The first thing I did was change all my passwords. Every bank account, every online service, every piece of digital access that Nathan had helped me set up over the years. I'd trusted him with everything, given him access to my entire financial life because I'd believed we were family sharing family responsibilities. Now I understood that trust had been weaponized against me. Next, I opened the joint account we'd established when he moved in, the one I'd added him to because I'd wanted him to feel secure, to know that he had access to resources if something happened to me. The balance showed $8,247.33, money I'd been saving for a new roof, for medical emergencies, for the uncertain future that waited ahead of me. I transferred every penny back to my personal account. The action felt both terrifying and liberating. For 78 years, I'd been someone who avoided conflict, who prioritized others' comfort over my own needs, who would rather suffer in silence than cause trouble for the people I loved. But sitting in the dark at 3:30 a.m., I finally understood that enabling someone's harmful behavior wasn't love. It was cowardice disguised as virtue. The next morning arrived gray and cold, typical for Iowa in late November. I made coffee for one person instead of two, a small act of rebellion that felt enormous. When Nathan emerged from his room at his usual time, his hair still messy from sleep, his eyes immediately went to the coffee pot, and then to me with confusion. "You didn't make me coffee?" he asked, his voice carrying the petulant tone of someone who'd grown accustomed to service without gratitude. "I made coffee for myself," I replied, not looking up from my Bible. I was reading Ecclesiastes, finding comfort in verses about there being a time for everything, a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. Nathan moved around the kitchen with obvious irritation, opening cabinets more forcefully than necessary, clattering dishes as he prepared his own breakfast. The sound of his frustration filled the space between us, but I refused to apologize for not anticipating his needs. "Are you going to give me the silent treatment forever?" he asked, settling at the table with a bowl of cereal. Cereal I'd bought with my own money, in a bowl I'd washed, with milk I'd purchased. I closed my Bible and looked at him directly. "I'm not giving you the silent treatment, Nathan. I'm just not performing for you anymore." "Performing?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Jesus, Grandma, you make it sound like I've been forcing you to act a certain way." There it was again, the casual blasphemy that had become so common in his speech that he didn't even notice it anymore. The boy I'd raised to love and respect Jesus now used his name as punctuation for his frustration. "Haven't you?" I asked quietly. "Haven't you been positioning your camera to capture me at my most vulnerable? Haven't you been encouraging me to tell stories about my loneliest moments? Haven't you been asking me to repeat conversations about missing your grandfather and your mother, because you knew they would generate emotional responses from your viewers?" His spoon paused halfway to his mouth, cereal milk dripping back into the bowl. For a moment, I saw something that might have been recognition flicker across his features. "That's not..." he started, then stopped. I mean, I never made you say anything you didn't want to say. No, I agreed. You didn't make me. You just created situations where I felt comfortable being vulnerable with someone I trusted, and then you monetized that vulnerability without my knowledge or consent. The words hung between us like a judgment. Nathan finished his cereal in silence, then got up to leave for work without his usual goodbye kiss on my cheek, without his usual cheerful promise to see me later, without the ritual of affection that had once felt genuine, but now seemed like part of his performance. After he left, I sat alone in my kitchen and realized I wasn't lonely. For the first time in years, the silence felt peaceful rather than empty. I wasn't waiting for someone to fill the space with conversation or activity. I wasn't anticipating the next moment when I might be useful to someone else. I was simply present with myself, and it felt like coming home to a house I'd been locked out of for years. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in decades. I called my old friend Margaret from church. Margaret Chen, who'd been trying to maintain our friendship despite my increasing unavailability since Nathan had moved in. Margaret, who'd invited me to Bible study groups and women's luncheons and holiday gatherings that I'd declined because Nathan needed me at home, or because I felt guilty leaving him alone, or because I'd convinced myself that my social obligations were less important than being available for my grandson. Helen? Margaret's voice carried surprise and delight. It's been so long since you called. How are you, honey? The question should have been simple to answer, but I found myself struggling to articulate the complex mixture of liberation and grief that was coursing through me. How do you explain that you're simultaneously heartbroken and relieved? How do you describe the feeling of waking up from a dream you didn't realize you'd been living? I'm discovering some things about myself, I said finally. Some things about my life that I hadn't recognized before. Margaret, who'd been a widow herself for over a decade, seemed to understand the weight behind my words. Would you like to talk about it? I could come over or we could meet somewhere. I've missed our conversations, Helen. The offer of genuine companionship, friendship based on mutual respect rather than one-sided service, felt like cool water to someone who'd been thirsty without realizing it. I'd like that, I said, and meant it more than I'd meant anything in years. That evening, when Nathan returned from work, he found me sitting in the living room with Margaret, both of us drinking tea and sharing the kind of comfortable conversation that happens between old friends who've weathered life's storms together. His expression shifted through several emotions as he took in the scene: surprise, confusion, and something that looked almost like jealousy. "Oh," he said, clearly not expecting to find me occupied with someone else. "I didn't know you had company." Margaret and I were just catching up, I explained, noting how his presence immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. We haven't had a proper visit in far too long. Margaret stood to leave, gathering her purse and coat with the gracious efficiency of someone who recognized social dynamics. But before she left, she turned to Nathan with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You know, young man, your grandmother is quite remarkable. She's been telling me about some of the challenges she's been facing lately. It's wonderful that she has family who cares about her, but I hope you understand how blessed you are to have someone like Helen in your life." The words were carefully chosen, polite but pointed. Margaret had been listening to my abbreviated version of recent events, and her protective instincts had clearly been activated. Nathan mumbled something appropriately respectful, but I could see him processing this new dynamic. The realization that I had other relationships, other sources of support, other people who valued my well-being. After Margaret left, Nathan and I sat in the living room together, but the silence felt different from the comfortable quiet we'd once shared. This was the silence of two people reassessing their relationship, of power dynamics shifting in ways that neither of us fully understood yet. "So," he said finally, his voice carrying a forced casualness, "Margaret seems nice. I didn't realize you two were still in touch." "We've been friends for 30 years, I replied. "I'd let that friendship fade because I thought I needed to be available for you all the time. But today I realized that was a choice I made, not a requirement you imposed." The distinction was important, and I could see him trying to process what it meant for our relationship going forward. If I had other friendships, other sources of fulfillment, other ways to spend my time, then I wasn't the isolated, dependent grandmother he'd been portraying to his audience. I wasn't the helpless woman who needed him to give her life meaning and purpose. "Grandma," he said, his voice taking on the coaxing tone he used when he wanted something from me. "I feel like things have been weird between us since yesterday. I don't want our relationship to change. You're the most important person in my life." But even as he said the words, I could see him glancing toward his phone, checking for notifications, mentally calculating how this new development might affect his content creation. The phrase "most important person in my life" had become just another line in his script. "Our relationship has already changed, Nathan," I said gently but firmly. "It changed the moment I discovered that you've been filming me without my knowledge and selling those videos to strangers. It changed when I realized that the love I thought we shared was actually a business transaction I was never made aware of." I stood up, my decision crystallizing as I spoke. "And tomorrow it's going to change even more." The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with November sunlight streaming through the kitchen windows as I prepared for the most difficult conversation of my life. I'd spent the hours before sunrise in prayer, my worn Bible open to Ephesians 4:15, reading over and over the instruction to speak the truth in love. But this truth felt like a sword I'd been avoiding for too long, sharp and necessary and terrifying to wield. At exactly 9 a.m., I heard Nathan's footsteps on the stairs. He'd been staying out later recently, probably avoiding the tension that had settled over our house like a thundercloud. When he entered the kitchen, his expression was wary, the easy confidence he'd carried for years replaced by something more guarded. "Sit down, Nathan," I said, my voice calm but carrying an authority I'd never used with him before. "We need to finish our conversation." He hesitated in the doorway, his phone already in his hand, a reflex as automatic as breathing. "Grandma, I'm going to be late for work. Can we talk tonight?" "No," I said firmly. "We're going to talk now, and you're going to put that phone away and listen to what I have to say." Something in my tone must have penetrated his defenses because he slipped the phone into his pocket and sat down across from me at the kitchen table. The same table where I'd fed him breakfast every morning for 3 years, where I'd listened to his dreams and complaints and daily stories with the patient attention of someone who believed every word mattered. "I've made some decisions," I began, placing a manila folder on the table between us. "Decisions about my life, my home, and my finances. Decisions I should have made months ago." Nathan's eyes flicked to the folder, then back to my face. "What kind of decisions?" I opened the folder and pulled out the first document, a printout from my bank's website showing the joint account we'd shared, now showing a balance of $0. "I've removed your access to my bank accounts," I said simply. "All of them. You no longer have any authority over my financial affairs." The color drained from his face as he stared at the statement. "You... what? Grandma, why would you do that? I need access to those accounts for emergencies, for household expenses." "What household expenses?" I asked, pulling out another document, a detailed breakdown of every bill paid over the past 3 years. "Show me one time you've paid the electric bill. One time you've bought groceries for both of us. One time you've contributed to the mortgage, the insurance, the property taxes." He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it as the evidence laid bare the reality he'd been avoiding. Every expense, every payment, every financial responsibility had been mine alone while he'd been telling the world that he was my caretaker. "That's not the point," he said, his voice taking on the defensive edge I'd come to recognize whenever his actions were questioned. "I provide other things. I'm here for you. I keep you company. I help you with technology, with things you can't do yourself. Help me with technology so you can film me without my knowledge," I asked. "Keep me company so you have content for your videos? Be here for me so you have a free place to live while you profit from my loneliness?" Each question landed like a physical blow, and I watched Nathan's carefully constructed self-image begin to crumble. For 3 years, he'd maintained the fiction that he was making sacrifices for me, that his presence in my home was a gift he was giving rather than a service he was receiving. "You don't understand," he said, his voice rising with frustration. "This isn't just about money. I love you, Grandma. Your family. Everything I do because I care about you." I pulled out another document, a printed screenshot of one of his recent videos, the one that had generated the most donations. The thumbnail showed me sleeping in my chair, my face peaceful but vulnerable, with text overlay that read, "She has no one else. Help me take care of her." "Tell me about this video, Nathan," I said, my voice steady despite the pain that seeing the image caused me. "Tell me about the love and care that motivated you to film me sleeping and then ask strangers for money to help take care of me." He stared at the printout, his face cycling through expressions of shame, anger, and desperate calculation. Those people wanted to help. They saw our relationship, and they were inspired by it. They wanted to be part of something beautiful. "Something beautiful," I repeated, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. "Is it beautiful to deceive people about your financial situation? Is it beautiful to accept donations under false pretenses? Is it beautiful to exploit an elderly woman's trust for profit?" "I never exploited you," he snapped, his composure finally breaking completely. "Everything I filmed was real. Those moments were genuine. I never made you do anything you didn't want to do, but you never told me you were filming," I replied. "You never asked permission to share those moments with strangers. You never explained that my private grief was going to become public entertainment. You never mentioned that people would be sending money because they pitied the lonely old woman they saw in your videos." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the neighborhood where I'd lived for 43 years, where I'd raised my daughter and buried my husband and somehow survived every loss that life had delivered. The familiar view gave me strength for what I had to say next. "I forgive you, Nathan," I said, turning back to face him. "I forgive you for lying to me, for using me, for taking advantage of my love and trust. I forgive you because that's what Jesus commands us to do, and because holding on to anger would hurt me more than it would hurt you." Relief flickered across his features as he heard the word forgive, but I held up my hand to stop whatever response he was preparing. "But I won't enable you anymore," I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. "I won't pretend that your behavior is acceptable just because I love you. I won't continue to support a lifestyle built on deception and exploitation. I won't keep paying your bills while you collect money from people who think you're supporting me." Nathan's relief transformed into panic as he realized that forgiveness didn't mean a return to the comfortable status quo he'd been enjoying. "What does that mean?" he asked, his voice small and uncertain. "What are you saying?" I returned to the table and pulled out the final document. A formal eviction notice I'd had prepared by a lawyer Margaret had recommended. "It means you have 30 days to find somewhere else to live," I said, placing the document in front of him. "It means I'm reclaiming my home, my privacy, and my dignity. It means I'm choosing to love you enough to stop participating in your self-destruction." He stared at the eviction notice as if it were written in a foreign language, his mouth opening and closing without sound. In all his 25 years, I'd never said no to him, never set boundaries, never imposed consequences for his actions. I'd been the soft place he could always land, the unconditional acceptance he could always count on. "You can't be serious," he whispered. "Grandma, this is my home. This is where I live. Where am I supposed to go?" "I don't know," I said, and the admission was both painful and liberating. "That's not my responsibility anymore. You're an adult man with a job and an income. You'll figure it out like millions of other adults do every day." "But I don't make enough money to afford my own place." The words burst out of him like a confession he'd been holding back for years. "My job barely covers my car payment and student loans. I need to live here to make ends meet." "Then perhaps," I said gently, "you should have thought about that before you decided to bite the hand that was feeding you. Perhaps you should have considered the consequences before you turned my home into a film set and my life into content for your business." The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of the kitchen clock and the sound of Nathan's rapid breathing as the full scope of his situation became clear to him. He'd been living in a fantasy where he could exploit my generosity indefinitely, where his actions would never catch up with him, where the woman who'd raised him would continue to enable his behavior no matter how harmful it became. "Please," he said, his voice breaking on the word. "Please don't do this. I'll stop making videos. I'll delete my accounts. I'll pay you back every penny I earned from those donations. Just don't kick me out. Don't abandon me." The plea cut through my heart like a knife, but I'd spent too many sleepless nights in prayer to be swayed by emotional manipulation now. This young man needed to learn that actions had consequences, that relationships required reciprocity, that love without boundaries wasn't love at all. It was codependency. "I'm not abandoning you, Nathan," I said, reaching across the table to place my weathered hand over his smooth, young one. "I'm releasing you to become the man God intended you to be. I'm stepping back so you can learn to stand on your own feet instead of on my shoulders." I pulled my hand back and folded it with the other in my lap. "You have 30 days, I repeated. "Use them wisely." The first morning I woke up alone in my house, truly alone for the first time in 3 years. I expected to feel the crushing weight of loneliness that Nathan had convinced me I couldn't survive. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. Peace. Pure, uninterrupted peace that settled over me like a warm blanket as I lay in my bed, watching the November sunrise paint my bedroom walls in shades of gold and rose. Nathan had left 2 weeks after our final confrontation, taking his expensive camera equipment and his resentment with him. He'd tried various tactics during those 14 days: tears, anger, promises of reform, threats to cut off all contact. But I'd remained firm in my decision. The last thing he'd said to me was that I'd regret this choice, that I'd realize how much I needed him when I was sitting alone in my empty house with no one to care about me. But as I made coffee for one and settled into my recliner with my Bible, and no hidden cameras recording my morning routine, I realized Nathan had been wrong about everything. I didn't need him to validate my existence. I didn't need his presence to give my life meaning. I didn't need his version of love, which had been conditional on my usefulness to his brand. What I needed was what I'd always had, but had forgotten how to access: my relationship with God, my connection to my community, and my own sense of worth that existed independent of anyone else's approval or attention. The first thing I did was call Pastor Williams at Cedar Falls Methodist, the church I'd attended faithfully for 40 years, but had gradually stopped participating in because Nathan always seemed to need me at home on Sunday mornings. "There's a live stream," he'd said whenever I'd mentioned wanting to attend services. "You can watch from home. It's easier for you." "Pastor Williams," I said when he answered, my voice stronger than it had been in years. "This is Helen Richardson. I was wondering if that women's Bible study group still meets on Wednesday evenings." "Helen," his voice carried genuine warmth and pleasure. "Of course it still meets. Martha Chen has been leading it for the past year, and I know she'd be delighted to have you join them. We've missed seeing you at church." "I've missed being there," I admitted. "I let myself get isolated, and I'm ready to rejoin the community." That Wednesday evening, I drove my reliable Honda Civic to the church fellowship hall for the first time in 3 years. The building looked the same, but I felt like a different person walking through those familiar doors. The women's Bible study group was smaller than I remembered. 8 women ranging in age from 55 to 83, all of them carrying the kind of quiet strength that comes from weathering life's storms with faith as their anchor. Martha Chen, Margaret's sister and a woman I'd known for decades, welcomed me with a hug that felt like coming home. "Helen, honey, we're so glad you're here. We're studying the Book of Ruth this month. Tonight we're talking about loyalty and new beginnings." The irony wasn't lost on me. Ruth, who'd left everything familiar to care for someone she loved, who'd found her identity in service to others, who'd eventually discovered that her worth wasn't dependent on her usefulness to anyone else. The parallels to my own story were so obvious they felt like divine guidance. As we discussed Ruth's journey from daughter-in-law to independent woman to beloved wife, I found myself sharing parts of my own story that I'd kept hidden for years. Not the details of Nathan's betrayal, that felt too fresh and personal, but the broader themes of discovering your own strength after years of defining yourself through relationships with others. "Sometimes," said Eleanor Martinez, a widow who'd raised 5 children alone after her husband's death in Vietnam, "we have to lose everything we thought we needed before we can find everything we actually need." The words resonated in my chest like a bell struck at just the right frequency. I'd thought I needed Nathan's presence to feel valuable, his dependence to feel necessary, his version of love to feel worthy. But what I actually needed was to remember who I'd been before I'd lost myself in the role of the endlessly giving grandmother. After Bible study, Martha invited me to join the group for their monthly dinner at Cracker Barrel, a tradition I'd declined for years because Nathan always seemed to have plans that required my presence at home. This time, I said yes without hesitation. Sitting around a table with 7 other women, sharing stories and laughter and the kind of comfortable conversation that happens between people who've known each other through decades of joy and sorrow, I realized I'd been starving for genuine human connection. The relationship I'd shared with Nathan had been one-sided, focused entirely on his needs and his schedule and his goals. These women saw me as a complete person, not just a source of content or comfort. "Helen," said Ruth Kowalski, a 79-year-old former schoolteacher whose husband had passed away the previous year, "would you be interested in joining our prayer circle? We meet every Tuesday morning at 9 to pray for our families, our community, and anyone who needs special intercession." "I'd love that," I said, meaning it more than I'd meant anything in years. The prayer circle became the foundation of my new routine. Every Tuesday morning, 5 women gathered in the church sanctuary to lift up their concerns and gratitude to God. For the first time in years, I had people praying for me by name, not as content for someone else's online ministry, but as a beloved sister in Christ whose well-being mattered to her community. During our second meeting, I finally found the courage to share my situation with Nathan, speaking in the kind of careful language that protected his privacy while still allowing me to process my grief and confusion with people who understood the complexity of loving someone who'd hurt you. "I've been struggling with forgiveness," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I love someone who betrayed my trust, who took advantage of my generosity, who used my love for his own benefit. I've forgiven him, but I'm learning that forgiveness doesn't mean I have to continue enabling harmful behavior." The nods around the circle told me I wasn't alone in this struggle. Every woman there had dealt with difficult family relationships, with the challenge of loving someone while protecting yourself from their destructive choices. "Forgiveness," said Martha, her voice gentle but firm, "isn't about pretending the hurt never happened. It's about releasing the poison of resentment while still maintaining healthy boundaries. Jesus forgave everyone, but he didn't let everyone take advantage of him." That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went shopping for myself. Not groceries or household supplies or items Nathan needed, but things that brought me joy. I bought a new devotional book, a soft throw blanket in my favorite shade of blue, and a small succulent plant for my kitchen windowsill. Simple purchases that felt revolutionary after years of spending every penny on someone else's priorities. I also stopped by the Cedar Falls Community Center, where I'd volunteered decades earlier before Nathan had moved in and convinced me that my time was better spent at home with him. The director, a woman named Sarah Patterson, who'd been a teenager when I'd known her mother, welcomed me back with enthusiasm. "Mrs. Richardson, I remember you from when I was little. You used to help with the senior meal program. Would you be interested in volunteering again? We could really use someone with your experience." The senior meal program provided lunch for elderly residents who couldn't afford groceries or couldn't prepare meals for themselves. The work was simple but meaningful. Serving food, washing dishes, sitting with people who were isolated and lonely, people like I'd thought I was, but realized I'd never actually been. Working with the meal program 3 mornings a week gave me a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with enabling someone else's dysfunction. I was using my skills and experience to help people who genuinely needed assistance, not subsidizing someone who was perfectly capable of caring for himself but chose not to. The regulars at the meal program knew me as Helen, not as someone's grandmother or caretaker. They valued my presence for its own sake, not for what I could provide or enable. For the first time in years, I felt like a complete person rather than just a supporting character in someone else's story. One Thursday afternoon, as I was helping serve lunch, I noticed a familiar figure in the dining room. Nathan sat at a corner table, his head down, his usual confidence replaced by something that looked like defeat. He'd lost weight, and his clothes, expensive items he'd bought with donation money, hung loose on his frame. Our eyes met across the room, and for a moment, time seemed suspended. I saw the boy I'd raised, the child who'd called me his angel, the young man who'd once sorted Halloween candy into piles so I could have the good chocolate. But I also saw the adult who'd betrayed my trust, who'd monetized my love, who'd built his entire lifestyle on a foundation of lies. He looked like he wanted to approach me, but something in my expression must have discouraged him. Instead, he finished his meal quickly and left without speaking to me. The encounter left me shaken, but not regretful. I'd chosen my path, and he'd chosen his. The consequences of our choices were playing out exactly as they should. That evening, I called Margaret to process what I'd seen. He looked lost, I told her. Part of me wanted to invite him home, to fix him a proper meal, to make everything better the way I always used to. But you didn't, Margaret said, her voice carrying both understanding and approval. You chose to love him from a distance instead of enabling him up close. That took tremendous strength, Helen. It doesn't feel like strength, I admitted. It feels like the hardest thing I've ever done. That's how you know it's right, she replied. The hardest things we do are usually the most necessary. That night, I sat in my recliner reading Psalm 139, the passage about God knowing us intimately, about being fearfully and wonderfully made. For the first time in years, I felt the truth of those words in my bones. I wasn't just someone's grandmother or caretaker or source of content. I was Helen Margaret Richardson, a daughter of the Most High God, created with purpose and worth that existed independent of anyone else's need for me. The house was quiet around me, but it wasn't empty. It was full of peace, full of possibility, full of the presence of a God who'd been waiting patiently for me to remember who I'd always been beneath the roles I'd allowed to define me. 6 months after Nathan left, spring arrived in Cedar Falls with the kind of gentle beauty that makes you believe in resurrection. The daffodils I'd planted 20 years ago pushed through the Iowa soil in my front yard, their bright yellow faces turning toward the sun like prayers made visible. I sat on my front porch swing, the same swing where Nathan and I had spent countless evenings talking about his dreams, watching the neighborhood come alive with the promise of new beginnings. The woman who sat on that swing was not the same woman who'd discovered her grandson's betrayal back in November, that Helen had been bent under the weight of other people's expectations, diminished by years of defining herself through service to someone who'd seen her generosity as weakness to be exploited. This Helen sat straighter, smiled more easily, and carried the quiet confidence that comes from rediscovering your worth in God's eyes rather than in human approval. My phone rang, interrupting my morning meditation. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the voice that greeted me was achingly familiar. "Grandma," Nathan said, his voice smaller and more uncertain than I'd heard it since he was a child. "Please don't hang up." I closed my eyes and felt the familiar tug of love and pain that accompanied every thought of this young man I'd raised. "I'm listening, Nathan." He paused, and I could hear traffic in the background, the sounds of a busy street that suggested he was calling from somewhere public. "I wanted to tell you that you were right. About everything. About what I was doing. About how wrong it was. About how much I hurt you." The admission should have filled me with satisfaction, but instead I felt only sadness for the months of suffering that had led him to this recognition. "Where are you calling from?" "I'm outside the community center," he said. "I've been coming there for meals for the past few weeks. I lost my apartment last month when I couldn't make rent, and I've been staying at the men's shelter." The instinct to rescue him rose in my chest like a tide, powerful and automatic after decades of conditioning. Every maternal fiber in my being wanted to invite him home, to feed him, to give him money, to solve his problems with the same unconditional generosity I'd always shown. But I'd learned to recognize that impulse as the first step toward enabling rather than helping. "I'm sorry to hear you're struggling," I said carefully. "What are you doing to change your situation?" "I got a second job," he said. "Nights at a gas station, weekends doing landscaping work. I'm trying to save enough for a security deposit on a place. I sold all my camera equipment, deleted my social media accounts. I'm done with that whole world." The information surprised me. The Nathan I'd known had been allergic to manual labor, had considered himself above service industry jobs, had been convinced that his destiny lay in fame and easy money rather than honest work. "That sounds like progress," I said, meaning it. "I keep thinking about what you said," he continued, his voice breaking slightly, "about how you forgave me but wouldn't enable me anymore. I hated you for it at first. I thought you were being cruel, abandoning me when I needed you most. A cardinal landed on the porch railing in front of me, its red feathers brilliant against the white wood. I watched it cock its head as if listening to our conversation, and I took its presence as a reminder that God was present in even this difficult moment. "And now?" I asked. "Now I understand that it was the most loving thing you could have done," Nathan said. "I was destroying my life and taking you down with me. I was so entitled, so selfish. I convinced myself that I deserved everything you gave me, that you were happy to sacrifice for me because that's what grandmothers do." I felt tears gathering in my eyes, not from sadness, but from recognition of the spiritual growth I was hearing in his voice. This was the Nathan I'd always hoped he could become: humble, self-aware, taking responsibility for his choices. "I've been going to a men's Bible study at the shelter," he continued, "learning about what real love looks like, what it means to be a man instead of a boy who takes from everyone around him. Pastor Rodriguez says that sometimes God has to tear down everything we've built on false foundations before he can help us build something real." "Pastor Rodriguez is wise," I said, remembering the elderly minister who'd been serving Cedar Falls' homeless population for over 20 years. "What else is he teaching you? That forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting consequences. That grace doesn't mean avoiding responsibility. That love sometimes looks like saying no to people who are hurting themselves." Nathan's voice grew stronger as he spoke. "That's what you did for me, Grandma. You loved me enough to let me fall so I could learn to stand on my own." The cardinal flew away, its wings catching the morning light as it disappeared into the oak tree at the corner of my yard. I felt something shift in my chest, a loosening of tension I'd been carrying for months. "I want to ask you something," Nathan said. "Not for money or help or a place to stay. I know I'm not ready for any of that, and I know you're not ready to trust me with those things. But I'd like to see you sometime. To apologize properly, face to face, to show you who I'm trying to become." The request was so different from the demands and manipulations I'd grown accustomed to that it took me a moment to process it. He wasn't asking for rescue or resources. He was asking for relationship, the kind that required mutual respect and gradual rebuilding of trust. "I'd like that too," I said. "But I have conditions." "Name them." "No cameras. No recording devices. No phones during our conversation. Just you and me, talking like human beings instead of content creator and subject." "Agreed," he said immediately. "Completely agreed. And I want you to meet me at church," I continued. "Sunday service at Cedar Falls Methodist, followed by lunch at my house. If you're serious about rebuilding your relationship with God and with me, then let's start there." The pause that followed was long enough for me to wonder if I'd pushed too hard, asked for too much. But then Nathan's voice came through the phone, thick with emotion. "Yes," he said. "Yes, I'd be honored." That Sunday morning, I sat in my usual pew at Cedar Falls Methodist, my heart racing with anticipation and anxiety. Would Nathan actually show up? Would this be another manipulation, another performance designed to get what he wanted from me? Or had he truly changed in the months since I'd set boundaries that forced him to confront the consequences of his choices? At exactly 10:55 a.m., 5 minutes before the service began, Nathan slipped into the pew beside me. He was thinner than he'd been, his face showing the kind of weariness that comes from genuine struggle rather than manufactured drama. His clothes were clean but clearly secondhand, and his hands, once soft from his easy lifestyle, showed the calluses of manual labor. "Hi, Grandma," he whispered, his voice carrying none of the practiced charm I'd grown wary of. This was the voice of someone who'd been humbled by circumstances and was approaching me with genuine vulnerability. "Hello, Nathan," I replied, studying his face for signs of the boy I'd raised and the man he was becoming. The service that morning was about the prodigal son, a parable that felt so specifically chosen for our situation that I wondered if God had a sense of humor about such things. Pastor Williams spoke about the father's joy at his son's return, but also about the son's recognition of his own unworthiness and his willingness to accept whatever relationship his father was prepared to offer. During the closing hymn, Amazing Grace, I heard Nathan's voice beside mine, rusty from disuse but earnest in its praise. "I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see." The words had never felt more appropriate. After the service, we drove separately to my house. I'd prepared a simple lunch, nothing elaborate, nothing that resembled the elaborate meals I used to make when I was trying to earn his love through service. Just soup and sandwiches, the kind of food that nourishes without making a statement. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where we'd had our final confrontation 6 months earlier. But the atmosphere was completely different. Nathan waited for me to say grace, then ate with the appreciation of someone who'd learned not to take food for granted. "I need to tell you some things," he said after we'd finished eating. Things I should have said months ago, but was too proud and too selfish to admit. I nodded, folding my hands in my lap and preparing to listen. "I used you," he said simply. "I saw your love as a resource to be mined, rather than a gift to be treasured. I turned your pain into profit, your loneliness into content, your generosity into an opportunity for my own advancement. There's no excuse for what I did, no way to justify it or minimize it." The words I'd been waiting to hear for months finally hung between us. But they brought less satisfaction than I'd expected. Instead, I felt only sadness for the time we'd lost, the trust that had been broken, the relationship that would have to be rebuilt from the ground up. "I accept your apology," I said, "and I forgive you completely. But Nathan, forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. It's going to take time to rebuild trust between us. It's going to require consistent actions, not just words." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking for everything to go back to the way it was. I don't deserve that. And honestly, the way it wasn't healthy for either of us. I'm asking for a chance to earn your trust back, slowly, on your terms." I looked at this young man across my table, my grandson, my former housemate, my betrayer, my beloved, and saw possibility where once I'd seen only pain. He wasn't the entitled boy who'd left my house in anger 6 months ago. He wasn't fully transformed either, but he was someone who'd been broken by his own choices and was now allowing God to rebuild him into something better. "Then let's start there," I said. "Let's start with Sunday dinners after church. Let's start with phone calls that don't include requests for money or favors. Let's start with a relationship based on mutual respect rather than one-sided giving." Nathan nodded, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for not giving up on me completely." "I never gave up on you," I corrected gently. "I gave up on enabling you. There's a difference, and that difference saved both of us." As I sit here now, months later, watching the sun set over Cedar Falls while typing this story on the laptop I bought myself with my own money, I'm filled with gratitude for the journey that brought me to this place. Nathan and I meet every Sunday after church. He's found his own apartment, pays his own bills, and is slowly rebuilding his life on a foundation of honest work and genuine faith, rather than exploitation and entitlement. Our relationship is different now, healthier, more balanced, built on mutual respect rather than dependence. He's learning to love me as a person rather than as a resource, and I'm learning to love him with boundaries rather than enabling. I think about the woman I was a year ago, lonely, used, diminished by years of defining myself through someone else's needs. That woman couldn't have imagined the peace I feel now, the joy I find in genuine community, the strength I've discovered in saying no to harmful behavior while still saying yes to love. Have you ever experienced something like this? Have you ever loved someone so much that you had to step back to save them from their own destructive choices? How did your faith help you find the strength to set boundaries while still keeping your heart open to grace? If this story resonates with you, please share it in the comments. If you know someone who needs to hear these words, please share this video. Sometimes God uses our stories to reach people who are walking through their own valleys of decision and need to know they're not alone. May God bless everyone who's ever had to choose between enabling and loving, between helping and rescuing, between being used and being valued. In Jesus' name, amen.